What's up, everybody? Today, we are going to be doing a little bit of a shop upgrade. We are going to be tiling the backsplash behind the slop sink here in the shop. For the last couple of years, this area has been getting downright gross. So by tiling it, I'm hoping to make it both more functional, because it'll be easier to clean, and maybe a little bit nicer to look at as well. I also happen to think that this is the perfect job for anybody who wants to learn how to tile. If you'd eventually like to tile your whole bathroom, but want a nice, easy, manageable way to learn the basics of tiling, then tiling a backsplash is a great starting point. This is something that you could do in a single day. Or at least you could do it in a single day if you weren't filming it. We'll see if I can get this done in a single day. But now, for the catch. And I suspect this is gonna be a catch for many of you at home too. I need a tile saw to get this job done. I do actually own a tile saw, this guy right here. However, this one is a little small for some of the tiles that I wanna cut today. So we are going to need some help from the sponsor of today's video, the Home Depot rental. If there's a job that you wanna do around the house or even on a job site and you're lacking a critical tool that would make that job a lot easier, you should check them out. Most of the time, it doesn't make sense to buy a tool for a single job. So renting it for a day, or even a week in some cases, is a great option. We are going to head over to my local Home Depot, pick up some tiling supplies, and pick up a big, heavy-duty tile saw. Let's hit the road. All right, so we are here at the Home Depot. I got all the tiling supplies we're gonna need and a tile saw. This is a DeWalt 10-inch wet tile saw. It has way more capacity than my other saw, and if I had to guess, it's probably also going to cut the tiles a lot easier too. Little bit of back of the napkin math. I rented that saw for $84 a day, and it retails for $11.50. So that means I would have to use this saw for approximately 14 days before it made more sense to buy it. And that is why I think that Home Depot rental is such a great option. They provide you with access to hundreds of high quality, heavy duty tools without that large upfront investment. So we are back here in the shop, and the first thing we're gonna do on this build is just prep our work area.
Just like with any job, the cleaner you can make your work area, the easier of a time you're gonna have. If you have any switch plates or outlets in your backsplash area, you're gonna wanna remove the covers and then pull those out. Just make sure you turn the power off at the breaker before you do.
I'm also going to remove these drawers here because I think once we get a little further along, they're gonna kind of be in our way.
These drawers actually ended up being a real pain, but we'll get into that later.
Now, the next thing I want to do is set up my tile saw. And I'm going to give you a little tip here that applies to every tiling project, no matter how big or how small.
You should try to set up your tile saw as close as you can to where you're actually going to be tiling. You're going to be walking back and forth between the two of them a lot, so if you can minimize that distance, you are going to save a lot of time.
Now that we got all the prep work out of the way, I think we're actually ready to start tiling. And the first thing we're going to start with is this countertop piece right here.
When you're tiling, you usually have some margin for error. Like here, I knew that my wall tiles would end up covering the edge of my countertop, so I recorded all of these measurements an eighth of an inch smaller than what they actually were. Finally, it was time to make the first cut. My countertop was actually going to be made from a big 16 by 32 floor tile. It's not the classiest option, but hey, it's also a slop sink in a workshop and not a luxury kitchen. Technically speaking, this is probably the only cut where I actually needed the big tile saw. You'll see, the wall tiles are a lot smaller, but that's the thing. You usually don't need these specialty tools for that long, and that's why it's so great to be able to just rent them.
Okay, let's see if it fits. Looks pretty good. So, in the tiling world, there's a bit of a debate between dry fitting and wet fitting tiles. Personally, I like to dry fit tiles when I know the cuts are gonna be a little bit more complicated. So if I'm doing something like a shower pan, then I will dry fit all of the tiles before. But when it comes to simpler stuff like installing wall tiles, I'll usually just wet fit them.
Your next step is going to be mixing up some Thinset Mortar. It's easiest if you add the dry mix to water and then mix it until it's approximately the same consistency as toothpaste. When you're at the store, tiling mortar comes in two flavors, modified and unmodified. For like 90% of tiling jobs, modified is going to be what you want. It has stronger adhesion and generally has a longer open time, which makes it easier to work with.
Now, I'll put some mortar down.
When it comes to laying mortar, your best friend is going to be the good old-fashioned 1/4-inch notch trowel. Use it to spread the mortar on as evenly as you can. Focus on doing long, smooth strokes and try your best to avoid having any voids or bare spots. For this little countertop, I also added a very slight slope to it by building up the mortar bed closer to the wall. This way, any water spilled onto it will roll backwards towards the sink.
So I went ahead and took 5 of these nice wall tiles that we're going to be installing and measured the height of them plus the grout lines that are going to go in between them. Give myself a nice little mark on the wall at 20.5. And now we're going to bust out the laser level. I'm going to adjust it until it's in line with that pencil mark that I just put on the wall. And now we're going to install some tile edging,
which is a decorative trim that covers up the outside edge of your tiles, and in our case is going to define the area of our backsplash. Now, the best way that I've found to cut tile edging is using a miter saw, but please, if you're going to do this at home, be very, very careful. It doesn't take much for the saw blade to catch and throw the trim.
It's always a little nerve-wracking cutting these guys. Now that they are cut, they are ready to be installed. And normally I would install tile edging using drywall nails.
But this time I wanted to try something a bit different. I wanted to try using CA glue. Eventually, the mortar will permanently hold the edging in place, but I wanted to see if super glue would work temporarily while I got everything set up.
Oh man, that is so much better than how I've done it in the past. Quick little tip. If you want your mortar to dry quicker, use hot water, and if you want a little bit more open time, use cold water. I want more open time, so I'm gonna use cold.
Again, it was time to mix up some more mortar. A lot of people will use mastic and adhesive back tiles for backsplashes, but personally, I'm not a huge fan of either of those, especially in wet areas. So we're gonna stick with mortar. Plus, like I said before, this is just good practice for future tiling jobs. With the mortar mixed, it was time to start laying our mortar bed. Given the longer open time of the modified mortar, I like to work a pretty large area all at once. Back in the day, I used to just lay enough mortar for the next few tiles, and I always had a really hard time getting the surfaces of my tiles to be perfectly consistent. These days, I find that working a larger bed like this makes getting a nice flat tile job a lot easier. When it comes to actually laying your tiles, I usually like to start with full tiles in the most visible areas and then hide my cuts where people won't be looking. For this job, that required a little bit of extra work because I had to start in what is essentially the middle of the pattern, but I was able to make it work by using a couple of drywall nails to support the first tile until the mortar was set enough to hold it on its own. Eventually, you are going to have to cut some tiles for your backsplash. What I like to do is measure the opening and then subtract the thickness of 2 grout lines, which in this case was a 1/4 inch. This big saw is definitely overkill for these little tiles, but I gotta say it did make the job go a lot faster. With the first row in place, filling in the rest of the wall was smooth sailing. Just a little bit of cutting, pasting, and spacing. And speaking of spacing, I like to use these really simple plus-shaped spacers for my backsplashes. There's all sorts of fancy leveling ones too, but I don't think those are really necessary until you start getting into larger format tiles. And then they become really handy really quick.
All right, I think this back wall here is looking pretty good. Obviously, we are going to tile down here, but I'm gonna give the mortar a little bit of time to set up. While we're waiting for that to happen, we're gonna continue tiling behind the actual sink.
This area was a little bit trickier than the last one. Not only did I have to cut out around these outlets and switches, but I also had the window trim and the faucet in my way. So, just like before, I laid my mortar bed across the entire work area and then got to work laying tiles. Before too long, I ran up against my first cut. The nice thing about cutting around plugs and switches is that you don't have to be super accurate. Their faceplates give you a pretty good margin for error. You can see that I'm basically just eyeballing the measurements here and then connecting everything with a square. Now, at this point, you might be wondering how I'm gonna make a cut like this in tile. Well, don't worry, I've got a pretty good system worked out. First, I cut both sides of the opening. Then, I reconfigure the tile saw so that it can make plunge cuts and rotate the tile 90 degrees. From there, I drop the blade into the bottom line and cut as much as I can. You should be able to weaken the tile enough that you can snap it by hand. Invariably, you are probably going to end up with some little bits of tile left in the corners, but those can be cleaned up by freehanding the tile against the saw blade. Now this might seem a little bit weird at first, but don't worry, the tile saws use abrasive blades so it won't catch or throw the tile. Just make sure you're wearing safety equipment to protect against any little chips. Now, it's time for the moment of the truth. Let's see how it fits. Hey, not bad. At that point, it was just more of the same for a little bit. I carefully cut and installed tiles around all the switches on the backsplash utilizing that same method. The last obstacle that I had left to cut around was that pesky window trim, and unfortunately, the pieces that I had to cut were going to have to be really narrow. But with a little bit of patience and a delicate hand, you shouldn't have any problem cutting even the thinnest tiles. Just be careful with them until you get them installed because they will be quite fragile.
All right, so at this point, we've been tiling for a few hours now and our mortar is starting to thicken up a little bit. But that's not a bad thing. That is going to allow us to do the gravity-defying tiling over here and on the other side of the sink.
This is one of those things that might take a couple of tiling jobs to get a real feel for, but at a certain point, your mortar will get the perfect consistency and you'll be able to just stick tiles right in place and not worry about them falling off the wall. Though, you probably will want to put some sort of shim underneath the last row in order to keep the tiles from sagging as the mortar cures.
So at this point, we are going to leave these tiles to dry overnight. I am going to pack up this fantastic tile saw, take it back to Home Depot, and then tomorrow we are going to continue by doing the grouting and all of the caulking. I thought I could get it done in a day, but filming everything always makes it take so much longer. All right, everybody, it is day 2, and today is going to be all about grouting and all those little final touches you have to do after tiling a backsplash.
Step 1 of prepping for grout is going to be removing all of your tile spacers. Another reason I like these simple spacers is that they're reusable. So as long as they don't get too covered in mortar, you're able to keep them for the next job. After that, it's time to get real serious about cleaning your tiles. You want to remove any excess mortar and really anything stuck to the front of your tiles. Take your time here because if you don't, your grout will likely end up clinging to it, and trust me, it's going to be a real pain to clean up later.
Just like when you're actually installing the tiles with mortar, when you go to do the grouting, it can get a little bit messy, so sometimes I like to mask off sensitive areas.
You'd be surprised, the dyes and pigments used in grout are actually really strong, so as a general rule of thumb, I'll mask off any nearby porous surfaces in order to avoid staining.
Now, let's have a very brief and frank discussion about grout. When you go to buy your grout, there are going to be 2 main types. There's sanded and unsanded. Sanded grout, as the name implies, has sand in it. This gives it 2 main advantages. 1, it doesn't shrink as much, so it actually ends up being a lot easier to work with and is better for filling large gaps. And 2, because it's got a little bit of texture to it, it generally provides more traction. Now, unsanded grout is a little bit trickier to work with as it tends to shrink a bit more. However, it leaves a nice flat surface that's easy to clean. That's why I've chosen unsanded grout for this backsplash.
Just like with the mortar, when it comes to mixing grout, I like to mix it to about the same consistency as toothpaste. Be careful though, because when you're mixing grout, a little bit of water goes a long way and it's really easy to add too much water.
In order to apply your grout, you are going to want to use a grout float, which you can load up with a spatula, and then you're just gonna smear it onto the wall in circular motions, a little something like this. For this tile job, I decided to use this platinum colored grout, which I thought was kind of fitting because it matches some of the veins in here, and also because it's like a darkish gray color. I don't have to worry about it getting too dirty over time. When it comes to doing this bottom line here, I like to put it right on the edge of my float, plunk it down on the counter like that, and just smear it in there as best I can. When it comes to doing super tight corners like this, there is no shame in just using your finger in order to get it in there. It's a little bit messy, but we'll fix that in the next step.
With the tricky corner taken care of, the rest of the grouting was smooth sailing. Again, work in small circular motions with your float and try to keep an eye out for any small bubbles and voids in your grout line. If you get any, just wipe more grout over them and they should fill right in. It's probably worth mentioning that grout floats come in a number of different shapes and sizes, so it might be worth investing in a couple depending on the job you have to do. Also, the less grout you leave on the surface of your tiles, the easier the next step will be, so try to be as neat as you can be.
Done. Oh man, who made this giant mess? All right, now we get to do the next part, which is cleaning all this up and making it look nice. Oh, and I should probably point out that from the time you apply the grout to the point where you start wiping it back should be about 15 to 20 minutes. You want it to start to set up a little bit without, you know, fully curing all the way. Because if it cures all the way, you will never get it off and you'll never be able to make it look nice.
With that said, when it comes to small backsplashes like this, you're probably fine to do it all in a single shot. At first, this step might look pretty basic, but this is really your last chance to shape your grout lines, so try to pay attention to the detail as you're cleaning. While you're doing this step, you'll quickly notice that your sponges become very saturated with grout, and at that point, they won't really be very useful for cleaning anymore. So when that happens, just grab a fresh one. Generally, I like to have 5 or 6 clean sponges on hand.
Things are starting to look pretty good. I wouldn't say that these tiles are perfectly clean by any means, but they're like 75% of the way there. Now at this point, many of you will be tempted to continue to wipe the tiles with the sponges, but counterintuitively, we're not gonna do that. We are actually gonna let what's left of the grout on the surface of the tiles dry to a light haze. We are going to remove it using our secret weapon on this project, blue shop towels. We are going to buff off the remaining grout. It's pretty simple, just grab a couple sheets, fold them up like so, and start swirling. I swear, you will not believe how well this works. Instead of spending hours trying to get it clean with damp sponges, you can do it so quickly using the blue towel method. Now, at a certain point, you're gonna find that your towel is just saturated with grout dust, so don't hesitate to just ball it up, throw it away, and grab a fresh one. Now that is looking much closer to 100% clean. We are almost done, but there's one little thing I wanna do, but before we can do that, we have to let the grout dry a little bit further. So we're gonna do a couple things around the shop in the meantime. The first of which is going to be replacing this plug right here. The keen-eyed among you may have noticed that this is not a GFI and really should never have a plug this close to a sink. So we're gonna replace this guy with a brand new GFI. Much better. I don't know this for sure, but I suspect the added thickness of these tiles on the wall is going to be an issue for these drawers closing. So, let's see, will this close? No. We are going to have to modify these drawers a little bit. We will just pop these drawer fronts off and then trim them on the miter saw. There we go. Much better. Okay, I think the grout is now dry enough that we can move on to the final step. So all of the places where we have two different surfaces meeting and a grout line between them, like the back of the sink here, we are going to apply a very thin layer of silicone caulking over top of the grout lines, because over time, this will almost certainly crack. But if we put a flexible silicone caulking over the top of it, even if the grout cracks a teeny little bit, the silicone caulking will keep a nice watertight seal for us.
As you can see, I have masked off all the areas where I didn't want to get any caulking. Now, some people would call this step overkill, but then again, out in the real world, I've seen nothing but really ugly caulking lines everywhere I look, so this is a good foolproof way to get perfect lines no matter what your skill level is. If anybody wants more details on this method, I actually did a whole video about it, which I will provide a link for in the video description.
And now one last pass with a finger to smooth the hard edge created by removing the tape. If you do it just right, you can barely even tell, unless you get your eyes right in there, that that grout line is even being caulked. You know, I was just about to say that we're done, but then I remembered we have one last little step left to do, and it's one that I'm personally pretty skeptical of. We still have to seal these tiles and the grout as well. Now, if I were working on a client's house, I would definitely go ahead and do it because it's not that much work. But seeing as this is my own space, we're gonna run a little bit of an experiment here. I think this should be a good test too, because this is pretty much the worst case scenario for a sink backsplash. We wash paint in here, all sorts of corrosive chemicals. If anywhere is gonna show an appreciable difference between being sealed and unsealed, it is gonna be this backsplash.
So here's the plan. I applied 2 coats of sealer to the right-hand side of the backsplash as well as the right-hand side of the countertop piece, and we'll see if they age any differently. Now at this point, I feel like I should point out that I'm really only skeptical of sealer on porcelain and ceramic tiles. On natural stone, it makes a lot more sense, and there I would never skip that step.
There we go, nice little natural experiment. I will keep you guys updated on how these age over time. We are now done, and I think that this is a huge improvement. Like I said before, this whole area is going to be so much easier to clean now, and also, come on, look at it. It just looks so much better. I know there are definitely going to be some people out there who question my choice of using a tile for a countertop instead of like an actual piece of countertop, but hey, come on, it's a slop sink in a workshop. And besides, the whole point of today's video was to show you guys how to tile a backsplash and to make the whole process of tiling a little bit more accessible for you guys at home. So on that note, I think this is the perfect place to end this video. Thank you so much for watching. Big thank you to Home Depot Rental for sponsoring this video and providing me with the towel saw to make this job a lot easier. Be sure to check them out if you need any tools that you don't have for an upcoming project. Or maybe you just want a better tool than the one you already have to make things go faster the way I did. Also, big thank you to all my Patreon supporters. I will include links to all the products I used in the video description. Again, thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next one. Peace.